The cold bit through the thick leather of his flight jacket, a familiar, almost comforting ache. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Jochen Müller, at 24 years old, already wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves at his throat, a testament to 68 confirmed victories over the frozen steppes of Russia and the chalky cliffs of the English Channel. Today, 14 October 1943, the sky over the German city of Schweinfurt was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind of clarity that made a fighter pilot's heart sing. Below, the sprawling ball-bearing factories were a patchwork of gray and brown, the very heart of the Reich's war machine. And it was Jochen's job, along with the other sharp-nosed Bf-109 G6s of Jagdgeschwader 26, to keep that heart beating. He adjusted the oxygen mask against his face, the rubber smell mixing with the faint, ever-present tang of oil and high-octane fuel. His eyes, pale blue and perpetually narrowed from scanning endless horizons, swept across his instrument panel. Everything was green, engine temps normal, fuel, enough for 2 hours of brutal combat, ammunition for his single 20 cannon and two 13 machine guns, full. Through the crackle of the radio headset, the voice of his wingman, Feldwebel Carlo Vogel, cut through the drone of his Daimler-Benz engine. "Heads up, Jochen. Bomber stream confirmed. Coming in from the west." Wehrmachts, the term four-engine monsters, was spoken with a blend of professional disdain and grudging respect. The American B-17 flying fortresses. Jochen keyed his mic, his voice calm, almost bored. "How many, Carlo?" A pause as ground control updated. Then Carlo's voice returned, laced with a predatory grin Jochen could practically hear. "Control estimates 300 plus. Escort reported as light. Probably those little P-47s. They'll have to turn back at the coast. As usual." A slow smile spread across Jochen's face. This was the dance he knew. The Americans had been trying to strike deep into Germany for months, their doctrine of daylight precision bombing a stubborn, costly fantasy. The Luftwaffe's playbook was simple, brutal, and effective. Wait for the short-ranged American fighter escorts, those thick, radial-engine thunderbolts they called jugs, to reach their operational limit and turn for home. Then the slaughter would begin. The unescorted bombers would be herded, harried, and torn apart by waves of German fighters. The Schweinfurt raid in August had been a bloodbath for the Americans. 60 B-17s shot down, over 600 men lost. The German pilots had called it Die Schwarze Donnerstag, Black Thursday. Today, Jochen thought, looking at the pristine sky, might well become Black Wednesday. He banked his 109 slightly, the morning sun glinting off the dark green camouflage of the fuselage, the black tulip design around the engine cowling that was his personal mark. Below and ahead he began to see them, tiny, glittering specks in the vastness like a swarm of metallic insects. The bomber boxes, flying in their tight, mutually defensive formations, and around them smaller, quicker dots. The escorts. "Jochen, look at them," Carlo chuckled over the radio. "They look like fat little bees buzzing around a hive. How do they even stay up?" Jochen's own assessment was more clinical but no less dismissive. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Intelligence profiles, which he'd studied, listed its specifications. A maximum speed of around 430 mph in a dive, heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns, but woefully underpowered at altitude, sluggish in a climb, and with the turning radius of a freight train. It was a heavy fighter, built for diving on ground targets, not for the delicate, lethal ballet of high-altitude dogfighting. It was no match for the sleek, high-altitude tuned Bf-109G, with its superior rate of climb and agility. The American pilots, he'd been told, were brave but inexperienced, trained in a hurry, lacking the Fingerspitzengefühl, the fingertip feel, that came from years of combat over Europe. They followed rigid, predictable tactics. They broke when pressed. They died. All units, this is Sau Control," the ground controller's voice intoned, invoking the tame bore strategy for directing fighters onto the bomber stream. Bomber stream is approaching Schweinfurt at 24,000 feet. Escort appears to be P-47s. Engage the escorts only if necessary. Primary target is the Wehrmachts. Break them apart. The order was a formality, a reflection of the supreme confidence running through the Luftwaffe fighter arm in late 1943. They didn't just plan to attack the bombers. They planned to ignore the fighters entirely if possible, considering them a nuisance rather than a genuine threat. Jochen led his swarm of 4 109s into a climbing turn, the G-6's engine singing as they sought the sun, the eternal German advantage. He picked out a box of B-17s, counting the tiny crosses of the escorting thunderbolts. 4, maybe 6, against his 4, plus the dozens of other 109s and FW-190s converging from other fields. Jochen, where Jochen? Carlo asked, eager. Ja, Carlo, where Jochen? Jochen replied, pushing the throttle forward. The 109 surged upward, a greyhound unleashed. In his mind, he was already tallying his 69th kill. It would be a bomber today. The fighters could wait. What Jochen Müller, ace of the Eastern Front and veteran of the Channel battles, could not possibly know was that the intelligence reports in his cockpit were dangerously, fatally obsolete. They were based on encounters from 6, 8, 10 months prior. They described the P-47C, an early hobbled model struggling with teething problems. They made no mention of the P-47D-10 now slicing through the thin, cold air beside the bombers, nor of the secret that hung from its belly, a bulbous, teardrop-shaped fuel tank that pilots were just beginning to call a drop tank. And they completely failed to capture the industrial tsunami that had been building across the Atlantic, a wave of metal and innovation that was about to break over the skies of Germany with catastrophic force. The dance Jochen knew was over. A new, far more violent one was about to begin, and he didn't know the steps. The confidence that bordered on arrogance in the hearts of pilots like Jochen Müller was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of relentless success. Since the early days of the war, German fighter pilots had dominated the skies. Over Poland, France, and during the Battle of Britain, the Bf-109 had proven itself a world beater. On the Eastern Front, aces like Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Rahl had run up scores in the hundreds against Soviet pilots flying robust, but tactically inferior aircraft. The kill ratios were staggering, often 10-1 or better in favor of the Germans. The Luftwaffe fighter arm saw itself as a knightly order, an elite brotherhood of skilled warriors whose individual prowess and superior machinery could overcome any numerical disadvantage. This cultural and technical arrogance was meticulously documented and reinforced by intelligence assessments. The WWII and Luftwaffe intelligence branches produced detailed, technical evaluations of Allied aircraft. A captured 1942 report on the P-47, for example, concluded, "The Thunderbolt is a large, heavy aircraft, inferior to the Bf-109G in all aspects of maneuverability and climb performance. Its primary advantage is heavy armament and rugged construction. It is unsuited for high-altitude escort duty due to poor performance above 25,000 feet and limited range." This assessment was technically correct. For the P-47 billion and early C models that first saw combat in the spring of 1943, German engineers, masters of precision and incremental improvement, could not conceive of the American approach. Produce a flawed design in the thousands, then iterate and improve it at a breakneck pace on production lines that never stopped. The prejudice went deeper than technical analysis. There was a pervasive belief in German high command, echoed in the mess halls, that American society was soft, materialistic, and incapable of producing soldiers or machines with the necessary Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. American pilots were cowboys or gangsters in the air, brave but undisciplined. Their industrial might was acknowledged, but it was dismissed as crude and quantitative, unable to match German qualitative superiority. A German general was famously quoted as saying, "What does it matter if they build 10,000 tanks if our one Tiger can destroy them all?" This mentality trickled down to the cockpit. A pilot like Jochen believed he was not just fighting an aircraft, but a culture, and his culture, the culture of the warrior technician, was superior. There were dissenting voices, of course, but they were systematically ignored or silenced. Oberstleutnant Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, had been warning since 1942 about the rising tide of American production and the urgent need for a true long-range fighter to counter the escorts. His memos to Reichsmarschall Goering and even to Hitler were met with irritation and accusations of defeatism. Goering, living in a fantasy world fueled by earlier victories, famously ranted, "I herewith give the order that the enemy bombers are to be attacked from ahead. I don't give a damn about the escorts. Attack the bombers. Shoot them down. That is your only task." Tactical reality was sacrificed on the altar of ideological bluster. More immediate warnings came from the front itself. After the August Schweinfurt raid, a handful of seasoned pilots returning from combat with the escorts reported strange things. Lieutenant Erich Sommer, who survived being chased by a P-47, filed a report stating the American fighter had stayed with him far deeper into Reich territory than previously thought possible, and had exhibited a surprising rate of climb in the engagement. His squadron commander, a veteran of Spain, scribbled "pilot error or exaggeration due to combat stress" across the top and filed it away. Another pilot spoke of seeing unfamiliar, sleek-looking drop tanks jettisoned from Thunderbolts before combat, tanks that looked different from the small, inefficient ones they'd seen before. The report was marked low priority, unconfirmed. The intelligence failure was monumental and multifaceted. German estimates of American aircraft production in 1943 were off by a factor of 2 or 3. They believed Republic Aviation could produce maybe 150 Thunderbolts a month. The actual number was climbing past 350 and would peak at over 500 per month in 1944. They knew about the Merlin-engined P-51 Mustang prototype, but dismissed it as a recon plane, unaware that the marriage of the British engine to the American airframe, orchestrated by a brilliant test pilot named Ronald Harker, had created what would become the war's finest escort fighter. They fixated on the bomber threat, pouring resources into twin-engine heavy fighters like the Bf-110 and Me-410, and the monstrous, complex Me-262 jet, while the solution to their impending doom, a simple, cheap, disposable external fuel tank, was being stamped out by the tens of thousands in American factories they had never even heard of. While Jochen Müller banked his fighter over Schweinfurt, the reality he was about to face was being forged in places like Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. The story of the P-47's transformation from a short-range liability to a long-range dominator is a story of American industrial genius and relentless problem-solving, conducted on a scale that defied German comprehension. At the heart of it was a man named Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born aeronautical engineer who had fled the Russian Revolution. Working for Republic Aviation, Kartveli was a visionary, but a pragmatic one. His initial design, the P-47, was built around the massive Pratt & Whitney RA-2000 800 double WASP radial engine, the most powerful American engine available. To harness that power at altitude, he incorporated a complex turbo-supercharger system, housed in the rear fuselage, with ducts running back along the belly. It was an engineering marvel, but it made the aircraft huge, over 7 tons empty, with a wingspan of 41 feet. Test pilots and early combat pilots derided it as the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or the milk bottle with wings. One general in the Army Air Forces reportedly said, "It'll never be a fighter. It's too damn big." But Kartveli and his team worked with a desperation and speed unknown in German aircraft design bureaus, which were often locked in bureaucratic battles and hampered by material shortages. The Americans had a different philosophy: get it flying, find the flaws, and fix them on the production line. The first major flaw was range. The early P-47Cs could only carry 305 gallons of internal fuel, giving them a combat radius of less than 200 miles, hardly enough to reach the German border from English bases. The solution was not one elegant breakthrough, but 100 incremental improvements. Engineers thickened the wing skin to allow for more fuel cells. They developed a new, simplified belly shackle that could carry a 200-gallon disposable steel tank, then a 375-gallon papier-mâché tank. The tanks were crude, cheap, and mass-produced. A pilot would take off with it, burn the fuel, and jettison it before a dogfight, restoring the aircraft's agility. The real secret, however, was under the cowling. The RMS-2800 engine was a masterpiece of robust engineering. While German Daimler-Benz and Jumo engines were precision instruments requiring scarce high-grade fuels and alloys, the Double Wasp was built to run on lower-octane fuel, to withstand incredible abuse, and to be produced in mind-boggling numbers. Pratt & Whitney didn't just have one factory. It had networks of subcontractors spread across the country, all producing standardized parts. By 1943, they were producing over 2,000 RMS-2800 engines per month. For comparison, Daimler-Benz's total production of all its major aircraft engine types in 1943 was around 1,500 per month. Then there was the armament: 8 Browning M1250 caliber machine guns, each firing at 800 rounds per minute. The combined rate of fire was over 6,000 rounds per minute. The ammunition mix, armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, was devastating. German aircraft, designed for lightness and performance, had minimal armor. The 50 caliber round could shred a Bf-109's thin skin, ignite its fuel tanks, or sever control cables from distances beyond the effective range of the Germans' slower-firing 20 cannon. American tactical doctrine evolved to exploit this. Boom and zoom. Use the Thunderbolt's phenomenal diving speed. It could exceed 500 mph in a dive, where a Bf-109's wings might rip off, to make slashing attacks from high altitude. Then use the power of the big engine to climb back to safety, never getting drawn into a turning dogfight where the 109 held the advantage. The production numbers were the final, overwhelming factor. Republic Aviation's main plant in Farmingdale was a cathedral of industry. It covered 1.3 million square feet. Assembly lines moved with relentless efficiency. A single P-47 required over 300,000 rivets, 15 miles of wiring, and 6,000 different parts. And yet, by 1944, they were rolling out of the factory at a rate of 1 completed aircraft every 3 hours. This wasn't just production. It was replication on an industrial scale that turned individual aircraft into a commodity. Losses, even heavy losses, could be absorbed and replaced in weeks. A German pilot who shot down a P-47 wasn't depleting a precious resource. He was scratching one unit off a ledger that was being filled faster than he could read it. This was the system Jochen Müller was up against. Not just a new model of airplane, but an entire ecosystem of innovation, production, and tactical adaptation that was moving at a pace his world could not track, let alone match. The reports on his desk were static snapshots of a dynamic, evolving organism. And on October 14, 1943, that organism was coming for him, fully formed and hungry. The first tremors of the coming earthquake had been felt, but the German High Command, trapped in its fortress of certainty, dismissed them as minor tremors. The signs were there, in the fragmented, confused reports filtering back from the front lines in the weeks leading up to the second Schweinfurt raid. In late September, a staffel of FW-190s from JG-1, operating over the Netherlands, engaged a formation of B-17s. They were surprised to find a squadron of P-47s still with the bombers well east of the German border, far beyond the previously established fighter limit. The German pilots, following doctrine, attempted to ignore the escorts and dive on the bombers. The Thunderbolts didn't just defend, they aggressively pursued the 190s into their diving attacks. The Focke-Wulfs, excellent aircraft, were heavier than the 109s and less nimble at high altitude. In the ensuing fight, 2 190s were shot down and several others damaged. The after-action report noted, with palpable confusion, enemy fighter escort demonstrated unexpected persistence and aggression. Their aircraft appeared to have improved high-altitude performance. The report was forwarded to Luftwaffe High Command, with a note suggesting possible use of improvised auxiliary fuel. It was filed under Tactical Anomalies, require further observation. More alarming were the loss statistics, which began to show a subtle but sinister trend when anyone bothered to look at them holistically. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, the loss ratio between German fighters and American escorts had been comfortably in Germany's favor, often as high as 3:1. By the late summer of 1943, that ratio had begun to even out, approaching 1.51. The Luftwaffe's statistical office attributed this to increased numbers of inexperienced pilots and the natural attrition of veteran personnel. The possibility that the enemy might be getting better, not just more numerous, but tactically and technically superior, was not seriously entertained. It was a cognitive blind spot born of years of supremacy. Individual commanders in the field grew increasingly uneasy. Major Walter Gull, Esau, a legendary ace commanding JG-1, wrote a private letter to Galland in early October. "The Amis are not turning back as they used to," he wrote. "Their fighters are with the bombers deeper and deeper. My pilots are reporting that the Thunderbolts are faster in the dive and can follow us through maneuvers that used to shake them. We cannot continue to ignore the escorts. They are becoming the primary threat." Galland agreed, but his hands were tied by Goering's edicts and Hitler's obsession with offensive, retaliatory bombing. Esau's warning joined the growing pile of unheeded prophecies. The most telling sign was a technological one, literally falling into German hands. In early October, a P-47D of the 56th Fighter Group, suffering engine trouble, made a forced landing in a field in occupied France. The pilot was captured, and the aircraft, relatively intact, was transported to the Luftwaffe's Technical Evaluation Center at Reichlin. German engineers swarmed over it. They were impressed by its rugged construction, the massive engine and the clever turbo-supercharger layout. But their report focused on what they knew: its weight, its size, its theoretically poor climb rate. They noted the shackles for an external tank, but, crucially, they had no example of the new, large-capacity tanks that were now standard issue. Their conclusion, delivered just days before the October 14th raid, reiterated the old wisdom: a formidable ground attack aircraft, an adequate bomber-destroyer when conditions are favorable, but fundamentally unsuited as a high-altitude air superiority fighter against the Bf-109G or FW-190A. The report was a masterpiece of technical analysis based on incomplete data. It was precisely, devastatingly wrong. All these disparate signals, the anxious reports from pilots, the shifting loss ratios, the pleas from commanders, the misleading technical assessment, formed a mosaic of impending disaster. But no one in the German chain of command possessed both the authority and the clarity of vision to step back and see the whole picture. The system was geared to confirm existing beliefs, not challenge them. The idea that the Americans could solve the complex problem of long-range escort in a matter of months, through brute force engineering and mass production, was simply outside the German strategic imagination. They were preparing to fight the last war, the war of individual aces and qualitative edges. The new war, The war of industrial systems and expendable resources was already underway, and they were blissfully, tragically unaware. So it was that at 9:47 Central European Time on October 14, 1943, Oberleutnant Jochen Müller led his swarm into the attack with a mind unclouded by doubt. The sun was at his back, his engine purred with power, and beneath him lay the proving ground of his skill. The glittering swarm of B-17s grew larger, their contrails painting fat, white lines across the blue. He could make out individual shapes now, the squared-off tails, the glint of plexiglass noses, and around them the smaller, darker shapes of the escorts. He counted again. Maybe 8 thunderbolts for this particular box. His 4 109s were joined by another swarm from a different squadron. 8 against 8. Fair odds in his estimation. Achtung, Jochen, Carlo's voice came tense but excited. The escorts are not peeling off. They're holding formation with the bombers. Jochen frowned slightly. That was unusual. Usually the P-47s, low on fuel, would be weaving anxiously, beginning their turn for home by now. These were holding steady, flying high cover. They're bluffing, he said into his mask, more to himself than to Carlo. They'll break once we commit. Remember, ignore them. Target the lead bomber in the second element. He rolled his 109 onto its back and pulled the stick back into his stomach, initiating a screaming Sturzflug, a dive attack, the classic German tactic. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 28,000, 27,000, 26,000 feet. The bomber formation swelled in his windscreen, the crosshairs of his Reich gun sight settling on the cockpit of a B-17. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the escorting thunderbolts. They weren't bluffing. They were diving with him. A flicker of unease, cold and sharp, cut through his focus. They shouldn't be able to keep up in a dive like this. The 109 was sleek, built for this. The thunderbolt was a barrel, yet there they were, 4 of them, following his swarm down, their shapes growing distinct. He could see the unusual blunt-nosed profile, the huge radial engine. And then he saw something else. As the first P-47 passed through 25,000 feet, a dark object detached from its belly and tumbled away, spinning in the slipstream. A fuel tank, but it was huge, far larger than the small 75-gallon tanks he'd seen before. His brain registered the implication a fraction of a second too late. Jochen, Sie werfen ihre Tanks ab, Carlo yelled. They're dropping tanks. They weren't at their limit. They were jettisoning empty tanks. They had fuel to fight. The realization hit Jochen like a physical blow. The briefings, the intelligence, the confident assessments, they were all wrong. These Americans weren't at the end of their tether. They were just beginning their mission. The tactical landscape of the sky inverted in an instant. He was no longer the hunter ignoring a nuisance. He was the prey, and the hunters had just shed their shackles. Break off the bomber attack, he barked into the radio, his voice tight. Engage the fighters, engage the fighters. It was too late. The diving P-47s, now free of their drag-inducing tanks, seemed to leap forward. Their dive acceleration was terrifying. Jochen, committed to his attack run on the bomber, was a sitting duck. He squeezed the trigger, his cannon and machine guns hammering, sending tracers arcing toward the B-17. Pieces flew off the bomber's wing, but his attention was shattered. A shadow fell over his cockpit. He yanked the stick hard left, his 109 groaning in protest as he broke into a violent evasive turn. The world outside dissolved into a blur of blue sky, white contrails, and the dark shapes of aircraft. He caught a glimpse of a P-47 sliding past his turn, impossibly fast, its 8 gun ports in the wings looking like the empty eyes of a skull. It didn't try to turn with him. It simply powered past, climbed steeply with a roar of its massive engine, and rolled over to set up for another dive. The energy tactics were flawless, alien, and brutally effective. The radio, once a channel for crisp orders, erupted into chaos. Ich habe einen auf dem Schwanz. I have one on my tail. Karl, help me, he won't shake. Where did they all come from? Mein Gott, there are more. Break right, Werner, break right. Jochen pulled his 109 into a steep, climbing spiral, his eyes darting to his mirror. Empty. For a second he thought he was clear. Then he looked up. Above him, a second formation of P-47s was entering the fray, fresh and high. They weren't just escorting, they were stacked in layers. As he watched, one of them tipped over and dove, not on a bomber, but directly onto a Focke-Wulf 190 that was trying to rally for another attack. The distance was immense, at least 1,000 yards. No one fired at that range, but the Thunderbolt did. A long, walking burst of 50 caliber fire, a solid river of orange tracers and invisible steel, reached out and stitched across the 190's wing root. The German fighter seemed to hiccup in the air, then a sheet of flame erupted from its engine cowling. It rolled once, lazily, and then began to disintegrate, pieces spinning away into the void. The firepower was apocalyptic. Jochen had seen 20 Mhits-tier aircraft apart, but this was different. This was a hailstorm, a mechanical scythe. A Bf-109 caught in a similar burst simply came apart, its tail section separating cleanly as if sliced by a giant's knife. He found Carlo's aircraft, weaving desperately with a thunderbolt glued to its tail. Jochen rolled and dove, lining up a deflection shot on the American. He fired a short burst. The P-47 pilot saw it, broke off his attack on Carlo, and instead of running, turned into Jochen's attack. The two aircraft hurtled toward each other, a jousting pass. Jochen fired again, seeing his round spark against the Thunderbolt's thick engine cowling. The American fired back, the air between them filled with lethal lead. Jochen felt impacts, a hard thwack-thwack-thwack against his fuselage, the sound of ripping metal. His instrument panel exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. A searing pain shot through his left leg. The 109 shuddered violently. He broke away, smoke now streaming from his engine. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of burning oil and electrical fire. He looked for Carlo. He saw his wingman's 109, trailing smoke as well, diving away toward the ground, a single, determined P-47 following him down, firing intermittent, deadly accurate bursts. Carlo, bail out, Rouse. Jochen screamed into the radio, but there was no response, only the hiss of static and the panicked, overlapping screams of other pilots. He tried to regain control, but the stick was sluggish. The sky around Schweinfurt, which minutes before had been a clean battlefield of his choosing, was now a swirling, chaotic hell. He saw not dozens, but what seemed like hundreds of aircraft. The bomber stream was immense, a solid wall of fortresses. And around them, weaving and diving like angry hornets, were not just a few token escorts, but seemingly endless waves of P-47s. They were everywhere above, below, in the sun. The light escort was a fantasy. This was a full-scale fighter offensive. His damaged 109 was losing altitude fast. He wrestled with the canopy release, the pain in his leg blinding. The canopy jerked back and was torn away by the slipstream. The roar of the wind and the battle filled his ears. He released his harness and, with a final, agonizing push, hauled himself out of the cockpit. The cold air slammed into him. He tumbled, pulled the ripcord on his parachute, and felt the brutal jerk as it deployed. Swinging beneath the silken canopy, a strange, suspended silence enveloped him. The roar of engines became muffled. He looked up. The battle raged on above, a silent, terrible movie. He saw a B-17, 2 engines dead, slowly fall out of formation. He saw 3 P-47s gang up on a lone Bf-110 heavy fighter, cutting it to pieces with concentrated fire. He saw, to his horror, more formations of Thunderbolts arriving from the west, their contrails fresh against the sky. They just kept coming. As he drifted down toward the patchwork fields of Germany, the burning factories of Schweinfurt now smudging the horizon with black smoke, the full, crushing weight of the truth settled upon Jochen Müller. This wasn't a setback. It wasn't a particularly tough mission. It was a revelation. The reports hadn't been wrong. They had been catastrophically, fundamentally incomplete. The Americans hadn't just built a new fuel tank or tweaked an engine. They had built a new kind of air force, one that could project overwhelming fighter power hundreds of miles deep into the heart of the Reich. The qualitative edge was gone, erased not by one brilliant design, but by a system that could produce, improve, and deploy machinery on a scale he could barely comprehend. His war, the war of the knightly ace, was over. And as his boots touched German soil and he was roughly seized by Home Guard soldiers, he knew with a chilling certainty that the howl of those double Wasp engines above him was not just the sound of a lost battle. It was the sound of the future, and it screamed with 850 caliber voices. The real question, the one that would haunt him and every other German pilot who survived that day, was just beginning to form. If this was what the Americans could do in October 1943, what unimaginable storm were they building for 1944? The sky, once a domain they ruled, now belonged to the Jugs. And this was only the beginning. The Home Guard soldiers were farmers, old men and boys with ill-fitting uniforms and ancient rifles. Their hands were rough as they pulled him from his parachute harness, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and fury as they looked at the burning sky. One of them, a boy no older than 16, pressed the muzzle of a Mauser 98,000 against Jochen's chest, his hands trembling. Terrorflieger, the boy spat, the word for terror flyer, meant for bomber crews. Jochen, his left leg afire of pain, his flight suit stained with oil and blood, shook his head. Nein, Jagdgeschwader, Luftwaffe. The boy's eyes widened, the confusion turning to something worse. A dawning horror that if this was one of their own aces falling from the sky, then the world was truly upside down. They half carried, half dragged him to a farm cart. As the horse clopped down a dirt road, Jochen stared upward. The battle was moving east, following the bomber stream, but the evidence was etched across the heavens in contrails and smoke. He counted 7 distinct pillars of black smoke rising from the fields and woods, crashed aircraft. He couldn't tell if they were German or American. It didn't matter anymore. The arithmetic of his existence had been invalidated. He was taken to a makeshift dressing station in a village schoolhouse. A harried doctor with blood up to his elbows glanced at his leg, administered a morphine injection that blurred the sharp edges of the world, and muttered, "You're lucky. The bone is not shattered. Many today are not so lucky." Through the fog, Jochen heard the whispers. The radio in the corner crackled with official bulletins, then with frantic, uncensored traffic from the Luftwaffe network. The numbers cut through the morphine. JG-26 reporting. 11 aircraft failed to return. JG-2 estimates losses at over 20, total bomber intercept force, rendered ineffective. The voice of the ground controller, once so assured, was now cracked with strain. All units, disengage. Repeat, disengage. The raid is proceeding to target. Schweinfurt is under attack. The words were a formal admission of defeat. The heart of the Reich's war machine was being pounded, and the Luftwaffe, the shield of the Reich, had been swept from the sky. Later, in a proper hospital in Frankfurt, his leg set and cast, the full reports filtered in. The second Schweinfurt raid, what the Americans would call Black Thursday, had seen 291 B-17s reach the target. The Luftwaffe had thrown every available fighter against them, over 300 single and twin-engine aircraft. The initial assessment was catastrophic. 60 B-17s were shot down, a staggering loss of over 600 airmen. But the German cost was hidden, a deeper, more mortal wound. Preliminary figures indicated 31 German fighters confirmed destroyed, with another 12 written off due to damage. But the real number, the one whispered in the corridors by staff officers with ashen faces, was closer to 65 aircraft lost. The kill ratio, the sacred metric of German fighter superiority, had collapsed to nearly 1. And for every aircraft lost, a pilot was gone, killed, captured, or wounded. Veteran pilots, men with hundreds of missions, were irreplaceable. The new cadets arriving from training schools had 160 flying hours, sometimes less. The Americans, he learned through the hospital grapevine, were graduating pilots with over 300 hours, and their aircraft were arriving by the shipload. A week after the raid, his squadron commander, Major Friedrich Karl Tutti Müller, no relation, visited him. The major, a legend with over 100 victories, looked aged, the lines on his face etched deeper. He placed Jochen's Knight's Cross with oak leaves on the bedside table. "You'll want this," he said, his voice flat. "Jochen, what happened up there? In your own words." Jochen described it. The escorts not turning back, the huge drop tanks, the terrifying dive acceleration, the layered fighter cover, the overwhelming firepower. He spoke of the P-47 that turned into his attack, the sheer brutal confidence of it. The major listened, nodding slowly, not in surprise but in grim confirmation. "We have a name for it now," he said. "Der grosse Schneepflug, the big snowplow. It doesn't matter how clever you are, how skilled. If a snowplow is coming down the road, you get out of the way. If you don't, you are pushed aside or buried." He stood by the window, looking out at the gray October sky. "Galland is screaming at Göring. The reports from Richlin have been revised. They took apart a drop tank we recovered. It's not even metal, it's made of pressed paper and glue. They make them by the 10,000, use them once and throw them away. We would spend 6 months designing a perfect, reusable aluminum tank. They solved the problem with cardboard." He turned back, his eyes hollow. "Jochen, we shot down 60 of them. 60 B-17s. A great victory, they will call it on the radio. But they will be back next week, and the week after, and we lost Carlo. We lost Becker, Schulze, Lehman, men it took 5 years to make. Who will replace them?" The major left, and Jochen was alone with the echo of the double Wasp engines in his memory. The revelation that had struck him in the parachute hardened into a cold, unshakable fact. This was not a temporary setback. It was a tidal shift. And as the autumn of 1943 turned to winter, the evidence mounted not just over Germany, but across every front where American industrial might was being brought to bear. While Jochen convalesced, a similar shockwave was rippling through the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, a different American weapon was revealing a similar truth. The F-6F Hellcat, a fighter built in response to the nimble Japanese Zero, was not a delicate instrument of finesse. It was, like the P-47, a product of overwhelming engineering and production. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats flown by pilots who had never seen a Zero before the war tore through veteran Japanese naval aviators. The Japanese doctrine of the lightly built, highly maneuverable fighter piloted by a samurai spirit met the American doctrine of armored, heavily armed aircraft flown by tactically trained pilots in a massive, coordinated system. The results were even more lopsided. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day against negligible American losses. A captured Japanese pilot's diary, later translated, contained an entry that mirrored Jochen's epiphany. "They are not better warriors, they are better mechanics. Their aircraft are like flying battleships. Our spirit cannot cut their steel." Back in Europe, the collapse was becoming systemic. The P-47s, now with even larger 108-gallon wing tanks, were roaming almost at will. Then, in December 1943, the first long-range P-51 billion Mustangs, with their British Merlin engines, began appearing over Berlin. The Mustang was not a brute-force hammer like the Thunderbolt. It was a scalpel, with a range that could take it to Poland and back, and performance that matched or exceeded the Bf-109G at every altitude. The combination was lethal. The Thunderbolts would clear the sky of German fighters, and the Mustangs would shepherd the bombers to the target and back. The Luftwaffe's response was a series of desperate, failed adaptations. In a design bureau in Augsburg, Engineers for Messerschmitt pored over wreckage of a P-51. Oberingenieur Ludwig Schmidt, a man who had helped design the 109, felt a reluctant, professional awe that curdled into despair. The report he filed to the Air Ministry was a masterpiece of technical admiration. The laminar flow wing design reduces drag by an estimated 20%. The placement of the radiator in a low-drag duct beneath the fuselage provides a marginal thrust benefit. The airframe is remarkably clean, and the marriage to the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine is superb. Our own DB605 engine, while excellent, cannot compensate for the aerodynamic superiority of this design when combined with its phenomenal range. His superior appended a note. The solution is the Me-262 jet. This piston engine technology is a dead end. But the Me-262 was trapped in development hell, delayed by Hitler's insistence it be used as a bomber, hampered by shortages of special metals for its jet engines. Schmidt knew the truth. By the time the 262 was ready in meaningful numbers, these Mustangs would be in the thousands. The tactical adaptations were just as futile. German pilots tried mounting heavier armament, 30 and even 15 cannon, to kill bombers in a single pass from beyond the range of the 50 caliber guns. But the weight ruined the performance of their fighters, making them even easier prey for the escorts. They tried forming Sturmgruppen, assault groups, of heavily armored and armed FW-190s to punch through the fighter screen. These tactics scored successes in the summer of 1944, but the cost was horrific. A Sturmgruppe required veteran pilots flying in tight formations, presenting perfect targets for the swarming American fighters. The loss rates often exceeded 50% per mission. It was a suicide club, not a strategy. The perspective from the highest command was one of denial spiraling into rage. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler received the Luftwaffe loss figures for early 1944. The numbers showed that in the first 4 months of the year, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,000 fighter pilots killed or captured. Production was replacing the aircraft, but not the men. Goering, facing his Führer's wrath, blamed the pilots. They lacked the fighting spirit of the early years. He thundered in a conference call with Galland and other senior commanders. I see reports of pilots avoiding combat, landing with ammunition unused. Galland, his voice tight with controlled fury, responded, Herr Reichsmarschall, the pilots are not avoiding combat. They are being slaughtered. When a pilot with 20 missions sees a formation of 50 Mustangs, his choice is not between courage and cowardice. It is between death and a temporary survival. We are commanding them to commit suicide. The line went silent for a moment. Then Goering's voice came back, petulant and final. Then they must die. It is their duty. The fighter arm must prove its loyalty through blood. The order went out. Stricter combat adherence policies, threats of court-martial for pilots who broke off engagements. The result was not more victories, but more losses. The experienced pilots, the last of the expert, were being systematically burned away. For Jochen Müller, returned to limited duty as an instructor in France by April 1944, the war became a grim lecture. He stood before rooms of young faces, boys with eager eyes who still believed in the myth of the invincible German ace. He showed them silhouettes of the P-47D and the P-51D. Forget what you have heard about fat, slow aircraft, he would say, tapping the image of the Thunderbolt with a cane, his legs still not fully healed. This aircraft can dive at over 500 miles per hour. You cannot follow it. If you see one above you, you do not climb. You turn, you dive for the deck, and you hope he does not see you. This, he tapped the Mustang, is worse. It can do everything your 109 can do, and it can do it for 5 more hours. If you engage a Mustang at equal energy, you will die. He taught them desperate, survival-based tactics. How to use the 109's superior roll rate at high speed in a scissors maneuver. How to lure the heavier Americans into low-speed turning fights near the ground. how to use cloud cover not as a tactical advantage, but as a life-saving blanket. He taught them not how to win, but how to live. The Jagdgeschwader's ethos of aggressive attack was dead. The new creed was evasion and survival. The strategic impact was absolute and irrevocable. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively been swept from the skies of Western Europe. Of the 1,000 fighter aircraft nominally available for the defense of France, only about 300 were serviceable on any given day, and fuel shortages grounded even those. When the Allies launched Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings, the Luftwaffe managed to fly only about 300 sorties over the beaches. The Allies flew over 13,000. The sky belonged to the Jugs, the Mustangs, the Typhoons. From his airfield in central France, Jochen listened to the radio reports of the invasion. He looked up at an empty, hostile sky. He knew what it meant. With air superiority total, the Allied ground forces could move without fear of aerial reconnaissance or attack. Their tanks could advance in the open. Their supply lines were secure. The war on the ground, already grim, was now hopeless. The final, crushing perspective came from behind barbed wire. In August 1944, as the Allies broke out of Normandy, Jochen's airfield was overrun by American armored units. He was captured without a fight. Joining a growing river of German POWs, he was shipped to a transit camp in England, then to a larger camp in the United States, Camp Ruston in Louisiana. The journey itself was a lesson in the industrial reality he had glimpsed from 28,000 feet. The Liberty ship that carried him across the Atlantic was one of hundreds, built in weeks. The train that took him inland seemed endless, pulling boxcars built by the tens of thousands. But the true, soul-crushing revelation came on a sweltering day in late 1945. The war in Europe was over. Germany lay in ruins. As a cooperative prisoner, Jochen was part of a work detail sent to a nearby airfield to help with cleanup. The airfield was a storage depot for surplus American aircraft. He stood at the edge of the tarmac, a broom in his hand, and simply stared. Row upon row, column upon column, as far as the eye could see, stood P-47 Thunderbolts. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They sat wingtip to wingtip, their olive-drab paint fading in the sun, their propellers still. They were not battle-worn veterans. They were factory-fresh aircraft, delivered after the war's end, now obsolete and unwanted. An American sergeant, noticing his fixation, ambled over. "Something, ain't it?" he said, lighting a cigarette. "We built so damn many of these things we don't know what to do with them. They're gonna chop most of them up for scrap. A shame, really." He followed Jochen's gaze. "You fly." "BF-109, Jochen said quietly, the words feeling archaic. The sergeant whistled. "Tough little bird, heard a lot about him. But you see," he gestured at the silent armada of Thunderbolts, "you can't fight that. That's Detroit. That's Pittsburgh. That's a whole country that decided to build airplanes instead of cars for a few years." He dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "Hell, this is just one dump. There's places in Arizona with 5 times this many. B-17s, B-24s, Mustangs, mountains of them." Jochen walked back to the truck in a daze. The numbers finally had a physical form. He had heard the statistics before. The United States had produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. Germany had produced roughly 34,000 Bf-109s of all types over the entire war, but they had been fighting since 1939, on every front, against every enemy. The American production was concentrated, overwhelming, focused. The Luftwaffe had destroyed, by their best estimates, around 18,000 P-47s in combat. Yet here were thousands more, never needed, rusting in the sun. The arithmetic was so absurd it was laughable. For every Thunderbolt shot down, 10 more had taken its place. The German fighter arm had not been defeated by a better pilot or a better single aircraft. It had been buried under an avalanche of aluminum and engines, an avalanche that began in places like Farmingdale and was now piled here, in a Louisiana field, as a monument to a productive capacity beyond his nation's wildest nightmares. The war ended formally for Jochen Müller in 1946, when he was repatriated to a shattered Germany. He returned not to a hero's welcome, but to a hungry, broken country where former aces were viewed with suspicion or pity. He found work as a clerk, then later, using his technical knowledge, as a draftsman for a small automotive firm. He never flew again. The sound of a low-flying aircraft would make him look up, his heart racing with an old, ingrained fear, but it was always a civilian plane. In 1962, a historian from the United States tracked him down. The man was writing a book about the air war over Europe and wanted the German perspective. Over coffee in a quiet Munich cafe, the historian asked, "What was the turning point? When did you know you had lost the air war?" Jochen did not hesitate. October 14, 1943. Over Schweinfurt. The historian looked surprised. Not later, not when the Mustangs arrived, or on D-Day. Jochen shook his head. That was the day the curtain was pulled back. We saw the real enemy for the first time. It was not the pilot in the cockpit opposite me. It was the factory that built his airplane, the refinery that made his fuel, the training school that taught him tactics designed to kill me without ever letting me fight back. Before that day, we fought men. After that day, we fought a system, and you cannot shoot down a system with a 20 cannon. He sipped his coffee, now cold. You asked when I knew we had lost. I will tell you a different moment. It was in a prisoner camp in America, looking at a field full of new airplanes that no one wanted. That was the moment I understood we had never had a chance. We were not defeated. We were rendered irrelevant. The historian wrote in his notebook. After a moment he asked, "And your friend, Carlo Vogel?" Jochen looked out the cafe window at the modern city, at the Volkswagens on the street, at the new buildings rising from the old rubble. "I learned after the war," he said, his voice very quiet. He did not bail out. His aircraft crashed near Bad Hersfeld. The American who shot him down survived the war. He became an airline pilot. He flew 747s across this very ocean. He turned back to the historian, his pale blue eyes, still narrowed from a lifetime of scanning horizons, now held a depth of resigned understanding. That is the final lesson, is it not? The man who killed my friend went on to build a peaceful world with the skills he learned in that war. We were not just fighting for the sky. We were fighting against the future. And the future arrived whether we were ready or not. It arrived with drop tanks and 850 caliber machine guns, and then it moved on. The historian closed his notebook. There was nothing more to ask. The story was complete. Jochen Müller paid for the coffee and walked out into the bustling Munich street. Above him, the sky was clear and blue, the same hard, brilliant blue as that October day over Schweinfurt 19 years before. But it was empty of everything except the sun, and the faint, distant contrail of a jet airliner heading west.